The Hollow Below. In the late fall of 2019, 3 amateur spelunkers, Dan, Rachel, and Leo, set out to explore an uncharted cave system in the Appalachian foothills of Kentucky. It wasn't on any of the local maps, but a reclusive hiker had posted vague directions on a backwoods forum. The hiker never posted again. The descent began normally: tight squeezes, cold rock walls, endless dripping in the dark. About 4 hours in, they passed through a narrow vertical shaft and found a vast, echoing cavern with a perfectly smooth floor, as if something had carved it out intentionally. They marked the route and pressed on, their headlamps growing dimmer in the heavy air. That's when Rachel noticed something strange. Their voices didn't echo anymore. The moment they crossed into the cavern, all sound seemed absorbed, as if the cave itself was swallowing it. Even footsteps were muffled. They joked nervously about cave acoustics, but Leo started to grow visibly unsettled. He said it felt like they were being watched. Not followed, watched. From below. Hours passed. The air grew warmer. Their gear began to fail, radios gave static, GPS flickered, lights dimmed even with fresh batteries. At some point, Dan realized something horrible. The cave had changed. The markings they left on the stone were gone. Every passage looked nearly identical. No matter which way they turned, they always seemed to loop back to the same smooth cavern. Except now, it was a little different each time. Sometimes the floor was sticky. Sometimes they saw shapes in the distance that vanished when approached. Then came the whispers. They weren't words exactly, just shapes of speech. Hollow, inhuman sounds rising from cracks in the rock, always just ahead or just behind. Leo snapped and sprinted off into a tunnel. They never found him. Rachel and Dan stayed put, rationing their supplies and clinging to the hope of rescue. After 2 days, Rachel awoke to find Dan staring at the ceiling, unmoving. His mouth was wide open, eyes rolled back. When she shook him, he collapsed into a pile of dust and pale ash, like he'd been hollowed out. She ran deeper than they had ever gone, not caring anymore about direction. That's when she found a door. Yes, a literal wooden door, carved with runes, embedded in the stone wall. Her headlamp flickered violently. She heard the whispers again, this time clearly. "You came too far. Now you stay." The last thing Rachel ever saw was the door creaking open. Her body was recovered a year later by professional cave divers, alone, untouched, eyes open, mouth agape. No trace of Dan or Leo. But in her pocket was a small rock, smoothed like glass, etched with a symbol that no one could identify. The cave has since collapsed in on itself. Locals say it was a natural seismic event. But some nights, hikers report distant voices coming from the hills. Voices with no echo. The Midnight Motel. On a long road trip through the desert, Sarah found herself far from the nearest town, the sun sinking below the horizon. Her car's gas gauge was running low, and she hadn't seen another vehicle in hours. She was exhausted, her eyes heavy, and the thought of driving any farther seemed impossible. As if by fate, she spotted a flickering neon sign in the distance. It was an old, run-down motel called the Starlight Inn. The neon was barely glowing, and the place seemed more like a relic of the past. But it was all she had, so Sarah pulled into the gravel lot. The front office was small, and the glass door gave a muffled ding as she entered. The old man behind the counter was hunched over a stack of paperwork, his face obscured by thick glasses. "Room for one?" he asked, barely looking up. "Yes, please," Sarah replied, relieved. He gave her a key with a brass tag that read Room 13 and nodded toward the hallway. "Last room on the left. Don't mind the noise." Sarah tried to smile, but something about the old man's voice sent a chill down her spine. She thanked him, took the key, and walked toward the room. Room 13 was tucked at the farthest end of the motel, and as Sarah unlocked the door, a cold draft hit her face. She stepped inside and immediately felt that something wasn't quite right. The air was thick, musty, like it hadn't been opened in years. The bed was made, but the sheets were yellowed and stained. There was an old TV that seemed to be stuck on a static channel, and the light above flickered erratically. Sarah didn't want to stay, but she had no choice. She locked the door behind her and took a quick shower, trying to shake off the sense of unease. As she lay on the bed, the room seemed to grow colder. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. It wasn't unusual for motels to have thin walls, but these footsteps sounded odd, too slow, too deliberate. At first, she tried to ignore it, but then there was a knock at her door. She froze. It wasn't the typical quick tap, tap, tap you'd expect from a guest wanting to check in or out. This was a slow, rhythmic knock, almost as if someone was counting. Sarah stood up and approached the door, her heart pounding. She hesitated, then pressed her ear against it. No voice. Just silence. She slowly opened the door, only to find no one there. Confused and slightly shaken, Sarah stepped into the hallway, glancing around. The motel was eerily quiet, and there were no signs of life. The only thing that caught her attention was the faint sound of whispers, murmured voices coming from a room down the hall. Room 12. Against her better judgment, Sarah walked toward it, her footsteps quiet on the old carpet. As she approached the door, the whispers grew louder, frantic. She was about to turn back when the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the room was completely dark, save for a single, dim light that flickered above the bed. The whispers were now audible, but they were no longer distant. They were coming from the bed. Curiosity gripped her, and Sarah cautiously stepped into the room. The bed was neatly made, but the shadows beneath it seemed to move. And then, she saw them, a pair of pale, wide eyes staring out from beneath the bed frame. Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing. Before she could react, a cold hand grabbed her ankle. She screamed, but the sound was muffled as she was yanked toward the darkness under the bed. Just as her vision blurred, everything went black. The next morning, Sarah's car was found in the parking lot, the engine still warm. Room 13 was locked, but inside, the bed was made, and everything appeared perfectly normal. No sign of struggle, no sign of Sarah. The motel owner was asked about her, but when the authorities returned to look for her, the old man had vanished. Not a trace. No records. No one had ever seen him before. But room 13, it's still there, waiting, and sometimes, at night, you can hear the soft whispers.